On the northern face of the Kursk salient, in July of 1943, the German army fielded 3 of the best protected armored vehicles anywhere in the world. The Tiger carried about 4 inches of flat plate across the front hull and the turret face. The Panther carried 3 inches of glacis laid back at 55 degrees and a 75mm gun with better penetration at range than the Tiger's own 88. The Ferdinand carried 8 inches of steel at the nose. Nothing in Soviet service could drill through that plate at any range worth talking about. Both armies knew it. Facing them, in very small numbers, was a vehicle designed and built inside a single winter. Its front plate measured 3 inches at the thickest point, thinner than a Tiger's and worse angled. It carried 20 rounds. It fired them at roughly 2 a minute, hand-loaded in 2 separate pieces. The crew could not see out of it properly, and on every column of that comparison, it loses. The Soviets called it the Su-152. Between the 8th and the 18th of July, one regiment of 12 of them reported 7 Tigers, 39 medium tanks, and 11 self-propelled guns destroyed. That report is inflated. The German records give a different accounting of the same fighting, and it is worth going through carefully. What is not in dispute is the physical evidence. German heavy vehicles came out of those 10 days with jammed turret rings, split welds and wrecked running gear, put there by a Soviet machine that had not penetrated their armor at all. The problem the Su-152 was built to answer did not begin as an anti-tank problem. Through 1942, the Red Army kept running into German field fortifications it could not reduce. Divisional guns were too light to break concrete and layered timber. Corps artillery could break it. But corps artillery had to be towed into position and unlimbered under observation, and it could not follow an attack once the attack started moving. What the Soviet command wanted was a heavy gun that carried its own armor plate and drove itself forward behind the infantry. The gun already existed. The 152mm gun howitzer of 1937, known as the ML-20, came out of the design bureau at plant number 172 under Fyodor Petrov. It was itself a rebuild. The design was a deep upgrade of an earlier Soviet piece, tracing back to a Schneider siege gun of 1910. It threw a 96-pound high-explosive shell to a little over 10 miles at about 2,150 feet per second, and by 1942 it was the standard heavy piece of Soviet Corps and Army artillery. Nearly 7,000 of them were built between 1937 and 1946. There was nothing experimental about it, and nothing left to prove. The chassis already existed too. The KV-1S was a lightened heavy tank, in production at Chelyabinsk from late August of 1942, built because crews had spent a year complaining about the original KV. That tank was slow. Its transmission failed, its steering punished the driver, and it occupied a heavy tank production line to deliver something that fought no better than a T-34. The fix was to take 5 tons off it. Armor came back down to 3 inches from the later 3.5. The engine deck was cut lower, and lighter road wheels went on. A new gearbox and clutch replaced the assembly that kept breaking. came out at about 47 tons, and it was the most reliable thing with KV written on it that the Soviets had built. It was also unloved. A good number of Soviet tank officers thought the Chelyabinsk line should stop building heavy tanks altogether and turn the capacity over to T-34s. Their argument was that a heavy tank which fought like a medium tank was a waste of a factory. That argument was never fully won or lost. It did, however, leave a heavy chassis in production that nobody was fighting to keep as a tank. Neither of those two objects was new. That is the whole point of what happened next. In November of 1942, the State Defense Committee ordered work on a heavy self-propelled gun. 3 design teams put proposals forward in December. One rival bunker-busting proposal was demonstrated on the 13th of January and rejected. The design selected belonged to Joseph Kotin, chief designer at the Chelyabinsk-Kirov plant and the man behind the KV series in the first place. Kotin's proposal had nothing clever in it. It was the ML-20 dropped into a fixed armored box on a KV-1S hull, with the gun itself barely touched. A few handles were moved so the gunner could reach them from a seated position. That modification earned the gun a new suffix and a new index, and it was very close to the entire extent of the redesign. Assembly of the prototype began on the 31st of December 1942. Stalin signed the decree authorizing the work on the 4th of January, 4 days after the plant had already started cutting metal for it. The factory order followed on the 5th. The gun mount was due on the 23rd of January, and the vehicle was to be at trials by the end of the month. The prototype, carrying the internal index 236, was finished in about 25 days. That figure is real, and it measures one specific thing. 25 days is the assembly of the first vehicle, from the day metal was cut to the day it rolled out of the shop. It is not the length of the program. From the November order to the day the design was accepted for service is closer to 10 weeks. Both numbers are remarkable. The shorter of the two is the one that usually gets quoted, without the qualifier attached. Trials opened on the 25th of January. The vehicle drove 53 miles to the proving ground and 55 miles back through a Ural winter that reached 44 degrees below zero. It fired 234 rounds of the 296 planned, 100 of them loaded with increased propellant charges specifically to stress the mounting. Average rate of fire across the trial came out at 2.8 rounds a minute. Afterwards, the inspectors went over the gun mount and the hull. Nothing had deformed. On the 14th of February 1943, the State Defense Committee accepted the vehicle for service and authorized the formation of 16 heavy self-propelled artillery regiments to receive it. 15 were built that month against a target of 30. In March, the plant delivered 90. 75 came in April, 84 in June, 80 in July. From a standing start at the end of December, Chelyabinsk was producing about 80 of these a month by the summer, on the same site that was building heavy tanks and T-34s at the same time. What was waiting for them at Kursk had been designed properly, over years, by people who were not working against a deadline like that. The Tiger carried 100 mm across the front hull and the turret face, a little under 4 inches, laid close to vertical but thick enough that the lack of slope did not much matter in the summer of 1943. Its 88 mm gun, firing the standard capped armor-piercing round, would defeat about 4 inches of sloped plate at 1,100 yards. Against a T-34 at that distance, the exchange was one-sided. German gunnery tables laid the numbers out plainly. Something close to 150 Tigers were committed to the Kursk operation, and the exact return varies depending on which strength report is used. The Panther was newer. In the terms that matter for a gun duel, it was better. 80 mm on the upper glacis, about 3 inches, but sloped at 55 degrees from vertical, which made it behave like considerably more. Its long 75 mm gun defeated about 4.5 inches of sloped plate at 1,100 yards, measured the same way. That is more than the Tiger's 88 managed at the same distance, out of a barrel with a much smaller bore. Roughly 200 Panthers were available for the offensive. They were also brand new and largely untested in the field. They broke. Engines, final drives, batteries and road wheels failed faster than spares could be brought forward, and within the first week a large part of the Panther force was sitting immobile behind the line instead of fighting in front of it. The Ferdinand was the extreme case. 90 were built in total. Something between 83 and 90 of them went to the northern shoulder of the salient with heavy anti-tank regiment 656, depending on whether you count vehicles on strength or vehicles actually running. 200 mm at the front, 8 inches, on a vehicle approaching 70 tons, carrying a long 88 mm anti-tank gun that outranged everything the Red Army had. No Soviet gun in the field could penetrate that front plate. That is not a German claim, and it is not a Soviet excuse. It was simply true, and it stayed true for the whole battle. The SU-152 set against those three vehicles is an embarrassing comparison. 3 inches at the front, about 2 1/3 at the sides, 3/4 of an inch on the roof. The 88 mm guns on the Tiger and the Ferdinand went through that at ranges where a Soviet crew could barely resolve what they were shooting at. 50 tons of vehicle, 600 horsepower from a diesel, 27 miles an hour on a road it would rarely get to use. The gun arrangement was harder on the crew than the armor was. The EML-20 used separate loading. In practice, that meant the shell went into the breech first, and the propellant charge went in behind it as a second operation. The high explosive shell weighed 96 pounds by itself. The armor-piercing shell weighed 108. 2 men handled that inside a sealed box with no powered assistance of any kind and a hand crank for elevation. 2 rounds a minute was the realistic combat figure. 20 rounds was the full load. Crews began stuffing 5 more into wooden trays on the floor to make 25, which tells you exactly what they thought of 20. There was 1 more man's worth of work in there than there were men. The fighting compartment had originally been laid out for 6, and the production vehicle carried 5, with the radio duties folded onto the gun commander because there was nobody left to give them to. So the man responsible for finding the target, ranging it and deciding when to fire was also the man on the set. The gun sight fitted at first was replaced during the year by a better one, which helped the aiming and did nothing about the workload. The rest of the vehicle was a list of complaints waiting to be filed. Visibility out of the fighting compartment was poor. The periscopes left large blind arcs around the vehicle. The traverse mechanism fouled the crew whenever they had to work around it. Fuel was carried inside the fighting compartment along the casemate walls, about 127 gallons of it, which is precisely where fuel should never be. Propellant fumes collected in the box with no extraction at all. 2 roof fans were finally installed on the 23rd of September, a fortnight after Stalin personally inspected one of the vehicles on the 8th. The first regiment equipped with them was the 1541st Heavy Self-Propelled Artillery Regiment, formed in the spring of 1943 under Guards Major Sankovsky. The establishment table of April set the regiment at 12 vehicles and 310 men, with 1 commander's KV-1S and 1 light armored car attached. 12 vehicles is not a tank unit. The regiment was organized as 6 batteries of 2, and that organization is the clearest single statement of how these things were meant to be employed. By the time the regiment formed, the Soviets already knew the vehicle could do something to a Tiger because they had shot at one. A captured Tiger was put in front of a 152mm gun in early 1943, and the result was that the turret could be dislodged by blast effect at effectively any range the gunner could hit from. That is not a penetration result. It is a structural one, and it was enough for the vehicle designed to break bunkers to be sent where the heavy tanks were expected. They were not meant to lead an attack. A pair of guns took a position where the ground funneled armor, waited, and fired at what came into the funnel. 2 vehicles working together could cover the approach between them and keep something pointed downrange while the other one reloaded, because reloading took long enough to be a tactical problem in itself. The doctrine underneath was artillery doctrine, wearing armor plate. Find the position, know the ground, let the other side come to you. The 1541st was held in reserve on the northern face of the salient, in the sector where the German attack was expected to fall hardest. That was the sector holding the Ferdinand. A second regiment, the 1529th, was attached to the 24th Guards Rifle Corps. Between them, that is a couple of dozen vehicles in a battle that involved 1,000, and it is worth holding that scale in mind before anyone credits the Su-152 with stopping Operation Citadel. What happened when one of those shells arrived is the reason the vehicle worked, and it has almost nothing to do with penetration. The standard high-explosive shell carried about 13 pounds of explosive filler inside 96 pounds of steel casing, and it arrived at roughly 2,000 feet per second. Against a Tiger, that shell was not attempting to make a hole. It did not need one. 100 pounds of steel and explosive striking a turret face transfers a shock the structure was never designed to take. Nobody laying out a turret ring in 1941 expected Corps artillery to be firing at it over open sights. The Soviets tested this properly and wrote the results down, and the test sheets are more useful than any veteran account. Firing at a Panther from about 1,300 yards, an armor-piercing round from the 152mm gun howitzer struck the upper front plate and ricocheted off it. The plate broke anyway. The recorded breach measured 14 inches by 18. A high explosive round at the same distance, striking at a 60-degree angle, went through the plate outright and left a hole about 14 inches by 15. Against a Ferdinand, a concrete piercing shell at 1,100 yards opened a breach 9 inches across in 8 inches of armor. An armor-piercing round at 1,300 yards broke a slab roughly 20 inches by 40 inches clean out of the front plate. Read those numbers as an engineer rather than as a scoreboard. A shell that ricochets and still opens 1.5 feet of the plate behind it has not failed at anything. The vehicle it struck is finished as a fighting vehicle, whether or not anything got inside. Optics shatter. Weld seams split along their length. The turret ring deforms and the turret stops turning. The gun mount shifts and the barrel no longer points where the sight says it points. Final drives crack under the shock. None of that appears in a penetration table, and every item on that list removes a heavy tank from the battle for days, or permanently. This is why the vehicle was issued mostly with high explosive rather than armor-piercing rounds. It was not designed as a tank destroyer, and it was never issued as one. It was a bunker gun that turned out to work on heavy tanks, because the way it broke them did not depend on beating their armor thickness. Soviet crews named it the Zevero Boy, which translates roughly as the Beast Hunter, and the beasts were the Tiger, the Panther, and the Ferdinand by name. The claim ledger from those 10 days does not survive contact with the German returns, and the arithmetic is worth doing. Between the 8th and the 18th of July, the 1541st reported 11 self-propelled guns, 39 medium tanks, and 7 Tigers destroyed. A second version of the same regimental record circulates with slightly lower figures: 5 Tigers and 37 medium tanks and 10 self-propelled guns, along with anti-tank guns, field pieces, and mortars. The two versions differ by a couple of vehicles in each column, which is normal for a unit record copied and recopied. Neither version has been checked against anything German. German returns from the northern shoulder describe a different shape of loss where the Ferdinands are concerned. Several were knocked out by heavy Soviet fire during those days. German after-action reporting on that action credits one Ferdinand as permanently written off, with the remainder recovered after dark, towed back, and put through the workshop. That German figure is itself contested, and it covers one action rather than the battle, so treat it as the other end of the range rather than the truth. That gap is not simply a Soviet exaggeration. It is a definition problem, and it runs through every tank claim of the war on both sides. A vehicle that stops moving, stops firing, and sits abandoned in front of your position is destroyed as far as the gun position is concerned. If the enemy owns the ground after dark, has recovery tractors, and has a workshop within reach, the same vehicle is a repair job. The Germans held that ground on the 8th and 9th of July, and their recovery was good. So the Soviet gunner and the German maintenance officer both wrote down, "The truth and the two truths do not reconcile." The Tiger figure has a second problem on top of that. There were around 150 Tigers in the entire Kursk operation, spread across both faces of the salient. 7 of them, credited to 12 vehicles in 10 days, is a very large share of a very scarce type. Soviet crews also called almost any German heavy vehicle a Tiger, the same way German crews reported almost every Soviet heavy as a Joseph Stalin later on. The 7 is best read as 7 German heavy vehicles engaged and hit, of types the crews could not identify at range through those periscopes. 12 vehicles, 20 rounds each, is 240 rounds for the whole regiment, and that is the arithmetic that constrains all of it. 2 rounds a minute, a single vehicle empties itself in 10 minutes of sustained fire. That is the regiment's entire fighting endurance before somebody has to bring 96-pound shells forward by hand, under fire, one at a time. No unit with those figures duels. Picks a position, fires a handful of rounds at whatever comes into the aiming point, and either reloads or moves. Which is exactly what the record shows they did. The Su-152 was employed as ambush and defensive fire, from prepared positions at ranges where the enemy had to cross open ground in view. The Germans at Kursk were attacking. That is the single condition under which a slow, blind, thin-skinned vehicle with 20 rounds is in the right place. And it happened to be the condition of the entire battle on both faces of the salient. The vehicle did not beat the Tiger. The situation did, and the vehicle was adequate to the situation. The verdict on Kursk, then, is narrow, and it should stay narrow. 24 assault guns did not stop Operation Citadel. What they did was demonstrate that a heavy field howitzer on a tracked chassis could take a heavy tank out of action without ever solving the penetration problem everyone else was working on. They also showed that the answer could be delivered inside a single winter out of 2 components already in production. The Soviet command drew the conclusion immediately. 670 of these were built during 1943, and total figures of just over 700 appear in some sources depending on how the last vehicles are counted. 90 Ferdinands existed in the world. That comparison is a production ratio and nothing more. There is no honest wartime exchange rate between a ruble and a Reichsmark, and anyone who prices one against the other is inventing a number, so the production ratio on its own is enough. The design was superseded the same year it appeared. On the 8th of November 1943, the State Defense Committee accepted the Su-152. It was the same gun in a better box, on the new Joseph Stalin heavy tank chassis with thicker armor and a hull that had not been drawn in 1939. The last Su-152s came off the line on the 20th of November. The first 5 of the new vehicles were finished by the end of that month. Nearly 1,900 were built before the war in Europe ended, and production continued into 1947. The old vehicles did not go anywhere. Regiments that had them kept them alongside the new ones, and units were still fighting mixed batteries of both types a year later. During the Lvov-Sandomierz offensive of July 1944, one Guards heavy self-propelled regiment went into the operation with both types on strength at once, which is what a shortage looks like when the thing in short supply is still doing the job. A handful of additional Su-152s were even delivered after production had officially been terminated in December of 1943 and January of 1944, presumably assembled from parts already on the floor. So the emergency answer became the permanent one. The guns stayed exactly the same. The EML-20 of 1937 had already fired at Finnish fortifications on the Mannerheim Line in the Winter War. It fired at Ferdinand's at Kursk. In 1945, the same gun was firing into buildings in Berlin, and by then the men working it had a vehicle around them that had actually been designed for the job. The generalization is one step and no armor design is a race between what you can build and when you need it. The Ferdinand was the more considered vehicle by every measure that appears on a specification sheet. Close to 90 reached the northern face of the salient in July of 1943, with 8 inches of steel at the nose that nothing could pierce. The Soviets did not attempt to match that. They took a gun from 1937 and a hull from 1942, bolted them together in about 25 days, and put a shell into the field that made the 8 inches irrelevant. A rough answer that exists in July beats an elegant one that arrives next year, because the battle is in July.